a topical sermon is actually much harder to do and prepare than an expositional sermon, because an expositional sermon is based on one passage. A topical sermon, if you do it properly, is to collect all the passages in the 66 books of the Bible that are relevant to any topic, even a topic like overcoming anxiety or how do you discern the will of God. All the passages that are relevant, study those within their context, figure out how they relate to each other logically, and then present them in a coherent way to your congregation. It's much harder to do properly. It is much easier to make exegetical mistakes or taking verses out of context. So then why do we find that so many pulpits have preachers preaching topical sermons? I think that at the core of it, unfortunately, many pastors and preachers are not trained to preach the Bible. They're not trained with exegesis. They are trained in theology, so they know theological frameworks and perhaps even the correct ones in terms of the major doctrines of the Trinity, of Jesus Christ, of justification, of sanctification, of glorification, regeneration or being born again, etc., etc. They can give you the summary of all those doctrines, but if you ask them on which verses do you base those specific doctrines, they can't really answer you. Many pastors cannot answer you. They don't know which verses to go to. And they don't know the explanation of the details of each verse within their context. And they erroneously think that topical sermons are easier to preach because it takes less time. But really, topical sermons actually should take more time if they do it properly. And sometimes, even when exposed to how to do an expositional sermon, some pastors become intimidated by it because they're not properly trained, because of the rigor that it takes to study verse by verse within its context. Study the logic of the arguments, study the logic of the narrative. If you take a book of Acts or any of the narratives in the Old Testament, or if you take an epistle or the letters of the New Testament and understand the logic of the argument of the Apostle Paul or the Apostle Peter or John, etc. It's hard. It is hard work. It takes great rigor. And if you want to actually do it with even greater depth, you need to go to the original language with Greek and Hebrew. So it's very rigorous. So some pastors think that a topical sermon is just easier, but really it's easier because they're not doing it properly, and they're just combining verses that they can think of, or their favorite verses that they think they're familiar with, combining it together, often out of context, and often missing other relevant verses of the same topic. And as a result, not really feeding God's people with the whole counsel of God, to use the phrase of the Apostle Paul in Acts chapter 20, in his farewell speech to the Ephesian elders.